So for tonight's episode, our second topic, our retro feature, is going to be actually some of our favorite comic books from yesteryear. So we do this from time to time. We just find some interesting things in our collection that we think other people might like. I'm going to be honest, my first pick this evening is something that may or may not be easy to get a hold of. I just love it, and I just thought it would be interesting to showcase it and talk about it because we've spent a good little bit of time talking about Flash Gordon, and interesting enough, the viewers chose the Flash Gordon sketch card as one of the cards to do for this evening. So I thought, well, isn't that just a fun coincidence that my first pick is actually Flash Gordon. So that scan is actually my actual book that I have. I've had this since I was a kid. The original printing of this book is actually from 1968. I didn't realize it was that old. Now, I am older, but I wouldn't have been born in 1968. However, I bought this book actually at a book fair in school. This was, I remember my grandfather reading me some Flash Gordon when I was a kid. I remember enjoying it, but this is like one of my earliest introductions, really, like, I think, to the character was this particular book. Now, the artwork in this is by Al Williamson. Al Williamson is obviously heavily associated with Flash Gordon. And what's interesting about this is the format in which it's put together. So the format for this book is actually what they've done is they've actually cut the comic strips actually apart and actually reorganize them in order to work in a digest format. So it's very interesting visually, like how it's put together. But all the artwork is by Al Williamson. The artwork is just absolutely beautiful. Just some really beautiful stuff in here. I'm not sure how difficult it would be. A lot of times with these segments, we try to find something that is easy to get a hold of, that's relatively inexpensive. But since we've spent so much time talking about Flash Gordon on tonight's show, and I've talked about how important this particular book was for me and how much I love it, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about Flash Gordon and the Ice Monster. So I'm going to read the summary here on the back really quick. So it says, and what's interesting about this story too is this takes place after they've battled Ming the Merciless and essentially won. So if you imagine the battle when the movie ends, then this story basically kind of picks up. And they actually have to go back to Mongo. So it says, fresh from Yale, Flash Gordon with Dale Arden and the great scientist Hans Zarkov, joined with Voltan, King of the Hawkmen, the beautiful Queen Freya, and Baron, the rightful ruler, to defeat Ming the Merciless and save two worlds. All thought the danger passed, but then, and obviously it says Flash Gordon and the Ice Monster. So anyhow, I can't recommend this book enough if you can actually run down a copy of it. It's a digest format. I would imagine these kind of books like this, the thing that's kind of neat is if you keep your eyes peeled for books like this, when you're in like secondhand bookstores or used bookstores, a lot of times these are the ones that'll be like in the kids section, or they'll be mislabeled and put in with the wrong spot. And usually they are dirt cheap. Now, I did not purchase this particular book in that manner, but sometimes these are the kind of books that you can pick up for a quarter, you know, if you're keeping your eye out. So I just want to highlight it. If you're interested in Flash Gordon, this is a fun thing to kind of keep your eye out as you're moving about and you're looking for things. It's a fun book. And then Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah, he said that cover is so cool. He enjoys it. And I think she's gone already, but Peggy did say goodbye. So we appreciate you, Peggy, for coming on the show and commenting. You had some great comments, great insight. So thank you for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you for being on the show, Peggy. And you're going to be the winner of the Orville sketch cards. I'll be hopefully either Eric or I will be reaching out to contact you and get your information. And I will try and get those cards in the mail to you within probably the next week or two. So I want to thank you again. I think it's fun that you came over here from Orville Nation and actually used the actual hashtag Orville Nation that we had discussed on the show, and I thought that was really cool. Thank you very much.
Right on. That's very cool.
Very cool, very cool. So this was my first pick, Flash Gordon and the Ice Monster, a fun book if you can actually run down a copy. So Eric, why don't we switch over to your pick?
All right. Let me see if I can pull up a graphic here to show the cover. I have the book physically. I'm always like a physical guy, and of course these are supposed to be kind of older books. So this was a before digital to begin with. Let's see if I can get there. There you go. I can see the cover. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't know about. In fact, I kind of stumped Dave a little bit with this one. So this is the Judge Dredd comic that DC Comics made. This is back in 1994. DC made a Judge Dredd comic, and this was actually before the Judge Dredd film with Sylvester Stallone came out, because I think a lot of people would think this was some sort of tie-in specifically to the movie, and I don't know the history if there was some involvement of maybe that was why DC wanted to acquire the rights. But what's interesting about this is this isn't just taking stories from 2000 AD and reprinting them. This is DC's version of Judge Dredd. They licensed the character and made their own stories, and it's pretty interesting. I think it's, if nothing else, it's kind of got a unique historical value because a lot of people are not even aware that DC did this. So I think it's kind of interesting. We've got as far as some of the people that contributed to this. The writer was Andrew Helfer. Most of the art was done by Michael Avon Omenging. Are you familiar with him? I mean, I can't. The name is.
It's Michael Avon Oming.
Oming. Okay, Oming. Michael Avon Oming. He did most of the art. There was also an additional colorist, letterers, and such, but he did most of the art, the penciling and the inking. And like I said, I think it's kind of a really unique historical artifact, and I think it's kind of cool that I have the first issue, and I really do like dig the cover. You know, I think it's a pretty cool cover. You know, show my physical copy here, and you can see it there in all of its glory. You can see Judge Dredd looming over all these dead bodies. It's very Dredd. It's very Judge Dredd. The funny thing is, and Bobby says, nice, old Dredd comics are great. They had some really dark stuff in there. And Bobby, you may be able to help me if you're a big Judge Dredd fan, because the thing that's funny for me is getting access to the 2000 AD books was almost impossible. It was almost impossible for me growing up. I vaguely remember some of the shops I went to maybe having them. And of course, 2000 AD had all sorts of stuff in it. So it didn't necessarily have Judge Dredd like in every issue. So getting something like this was really kind of unique because DC was doing this, and therefore it was available on a much larger scale than 2000 AD comics were, because, you know, I grew up in Arizona, and, 2000 AD books are not common here, you know. They're hard to find. So it's interesting with the story. What they did was they decided to place Judge Dredd at the early moments of the history of the megacities. So Judge Dredd in the 2000 AD comics, it's kind of like things are more or less like already established, and then you kind of get some backstory as things are going on. Like, for instance, the president of the United States is kind of like, as I understand it in the 2000 AD books, he's kind of referred to like in the past tense because they had an upheaval and the president, there is no United States anymore. The megacities are basically independent. But initially, the United States still existed when the megacities were first formed. That's part of the history and the lore of Judge Dredd. And in this version, the United States still exists. And also in this version, they still have police officers. And the judges are just supposed to come after, basically after the fact, and do the judging, on scene. And they're not actually kind of like the way that we would see them in the movie, or either of the movies for that matter. And we still have police. There's still police, but the police are very corrupt. And I guess that's one of the reasons that the judges end up sort of taking over. And in this version, Dredd is very much like active as he is in the 2000 AD series. He's very hands-on. The very first scene in this book, he's actually like taking down this like dirigible type vehicle that's been taken over by these criminals, and they're using to transport like illegal goods and stuff. And he's doing all this stuff that they're basically saying he's not supposed to be doing because the police are supposed to be doing that. So it's kind of interesting. So they kind of play with that concept that before the judges took over, they still had police. They still had a little bit of separation of powers, if you will. The traditional separation of powers in government. And so the book is neat in that it kind of shows the transition where the judges are having to take over more because the police are so corrupt, and in effect, basically, one of the main parts of this story is that the police are working with one of the major criminal syndicates, and they're basically on the take and everything like that. So the funny thing about it is there's so much of the very dark humor in it, really kind of almost silly over the top. And it has a very RoboCop vibe. There's very much like a RoboCop kind of humor in it. And I don't know how deliberate that was, but it's there. It's definitely there. And this was a very short-lived series. It only lasted, I think, 18 issues. So it only lasted about a year and a half. That's another reason I think a lot of people don't know about it. So it obviously did not take very well, and people didn't like it. But I think it's kind of a very unique piece of history.
Well, I was just going to point out, just for point of order, it's widely believed, and I've had it almost about confirmed from some different people, that Judge Dredd was a heavy point of inspiration actually for RoboCop. A matter of fact, if you actually see some of Rob Bottin's actual original sculpts when he was actually creating the armor for RoboCop, he looks just like Judge Dredd.
Well, the visor is clearly very similar, with the whole idea that you can only see the bottom of Dredd's face, and that was actually a big sticking point for the Carl Urban version of Judge Dredd, and one of the reasons that Sylvester Stallone's version is panned so badly, which I actually like the Sylvester Stallone version. I think it's kind of on a guilty pleasure level, but I actually do enjoy it, and that was really my first introduction to the character. And I think the reason that I bought this comic book in the first place was because I saw a preview for the movie. And so then I saw the cover, and I was like, oh, let me check this out. Because I didn't know anything about Judge Dredd, growing up. This didn't, like I said, I didn't have access to 2000 AD comics. Those are like impossible to get growing up as a kid.
Yeah.
And James, right? It's James.
Yep.
He says, "Hey guys, have video conference calls early in the morning, so good night and thanks. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for commenting. We really appreciate it. And please have a good night. Please have a good night. Be safe."
Let's real quick before we go into another pick here, just real quick. Could you give me a number between 1 and 4?
1.
Okay. So can you now give me another number between 1 and 4 that's not, give me a number between 2, 3, and 4.
3.
3. Okay. All right. All right, so just real quick, we'll just make the quick announcement here. So, is her name Ayako? Is that right? Who comments?
Yes, Ayoko, I think. Yeah, I think
Ayoko.
that's right.
Okay. She's in the States, right? Do you think?
DC. Remember, she's
That's right.
talked
Okay.
about that before. She's in
Well,
DC.
congratulations, Ayako. You actually won the Flash Gordon sketch card for this evening. Um, Congratulations. One of us will be reaching out to contact you in order to get your information so we can actually put this in the mail to you. And then our other winner this evening is going to actually be Bobby Chambers. If you don't have enough of my sketch cards already, it looks like you're going to get to add Moon Knight to your collection as well. So again, thank you for being on the show and commenting. So,
Right on.
all right, very cool. All right, and luckily enough, I already have your information, and I have another label printed out, so I can get yours in the mail pretty quick. So that one's ready to go. Yeah, the connections between Judge Dredd and RoboCop are pretty amazing. I am more than a Judge Dredd fan. I am a huge RoboCop fan, so I'm pretty well versed in Dredd just because of how fascinated I was in the connections between Dredd and RoboCop. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But there's clearly a lot of RoboCop in there in this one, and I get that feeling that maybe some of the audience kind of saw that and felt like they were trying to, like it wasn't really Dredd. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. I know this book didn't last long. This series did not last long. So clearly it wasn't popular. so
right.
It was, they would have kept going. Unless, the licensing deal fell through or something like that. It'd be interesting to know more of the history of the behind the scenes, if it was poorly received or if it was some sort of licensing problem that eventually they wrangled the rights back, to some other company or whatever.
And it would be interesting too, because I mentioned earlier I could reach out to Stephen Reed, who's a friend and who's actually been on the show in the past, and actually have, Stephen might have some interesting information about that, because he actually does a 2000 AD podcast, and is friendly or on a somewhat friendly basis with a lot of the folks actually at 2000 AD. And he might know a little bit of the history behind this particular book. It'd be interesting to delve into, just out of curiosity, because, like I said, I don't ever remember DC publishing this book, so I was kind of a little taken aback. I was like, when did DC publish a Judge Dredd book? It's like, when did that happen?
Yep. 1994. So
totally missed that somehow.
And Bobby said, says my buddy growing up had Judge Dredd, Heavy Metal Magazine, and trauma movies from his dad. So he's exposed to all that at a young age. And that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that I didn't have a lot of any of that around, to be honest. I was aware of things like heavy metal, and I think because of the movie, really, which was an adult animated movie, which was kind of unique. I think that's why I knew about it. But I wasn't allowed to watch it growing up. That was for sure. And trauma was another thing that I was aware of, but I wasn't allowed to watch that kind of stuff. But yeah, Judge Dredd was hard to come by. There's just no doubt about it. If you lived in the States growing up, in the 80s, 90s, getting Judge Dredd stuff was not easy. The movie helped. The movie definitely helped when it came out. And there was more Judge Dredd stuff. But the movie also was considered a little bit of, basically kind of a bomb. So it didn't necessarily help things that much either. So, but again, I think it's a unique thing in comic book history that DC was publishing their own Judge Dredd comic books with an alternate timeline.
Right. Very cool. Are we good to move on to the? I have one more pick, and all right, very cool.
There we go.
All right, so this is my second and last pick for this evening. We typically usually do about three. This is one of my favorite comic books. as most people know, I'm, besides having actually worked on Batman a couple of times for DC Comics, I am a huge Batman fan. Um, Batman is my favorite superhero, actually. And this was a really great comic. This is Batman 436. This was actually they did a series of these different stories where they did, of course, Year One, Frank Miller, David Mazzucchelli. Required reading if you're a Batman fan. One of the best Batman stories ever told. It was 4 issues that actually ran in the Batman series. Really great stuff. Then they did a follow-up to that, which was Year Two. Year Two actually features some amazing art, actually initially by Todd McFarlane, who actually worked on that just briefly. Then he actually left that book, and Alan Davis, if I remember correctly, actually came in and finished it out and did an absolutely killer job. That series introduced the character of the Reaper, which Phantasm is an original creation, but I always felt like that Reaper and Phantasm had a lot of connection. If you're a diehard Batman fan, you're aware of what I'm talking about. But this is actually Year Three. The thing that's interesting about Batman Year Three, as you can tell from the cover, this is a George Perez cover. It's a beautiful cover. All these covers done by George Perez are absolutely gorgeous. Obviously, Batman Year Three focuses more on how Batman and Robin actually came to work together. But it also foreshadows some things, because you can clearly see Nightwing is actually on this cover as well. So the creative team on this book, I'm just going to read it from the actual the credits here in the comic itself. The writer was Marv Wolfman. The pencils were by Pat Broderick. The inks were by John Beatty, no relation. And the editor for this was actually Denny O'Neil. Denny O'Neil, of course, the legendary Denny O'Neil Batman editor, as well as Batman writer, who I'm also quite fond of because of his work on The Question. But of course, Marv Wolfman, legendary DC Comics writer, when you consider his work on Titans, the co-creator of Blade, fantastic writer. And Pat Broderick, he kind of came out of some fire a few years ago because of some comments that he made in relation to some of the cosplay community, because he felt like that the cosplayers were taking up kind of too much space in the convention circuit for his taste. But Pat Broderick is a fantastic...
Who said that? Who said that, Dave?
Pat Broderick did.
Interesting.
Yeah. Pat Broderick, but he's always been one of my favorite comic artists. He was, when they reintroduced Firestorm into the DC universe, he was the original artist on Firestorm, and he did some great work on Firestorm. He's done some great work on Batman, but he's also done some great work on Green Lantern. He's actually, for me, one of my key Green Lantern artists is actually Pat Broderick. But the artwork in this book is absolutely it's just really cool, and it's a great story because it focuses more on Robin. This takes place after the events that, it takes place in 2 different timelines, one of which is obviously after Jason Todd has died. Spoiler alert, who is the second Robin after Dick Grayson. And then Dick Grayson actually comes back to try and see what state Batman is in. And then in the process of that, we get the whole backstory, of how Dick Grayson became Robin, and how their working partnership as the dynamic duo basically began. But that scan is actually my copy of Batman Year One. This is my actual original copy. I've had this for a very long time. I love this book. I can't recommend it enough. I don't know if Year Three is going to set you back this particular issue. I haven't had a chance to research it. They did actually collect this as a trade paperback, I know, at one point, this particular series. And they actually took the artwork that George Perez did for these covers, and they actually made a portfolio out of them of just the black and white art. And it is absolutely beautiful. So this is my pick for one of my favorite comics from Yesteryear, Batman 436, Year 3, Part 1. So tell me, Eric, were you familiar with this particular comic?
No, not at all. Actually, I've heard of Batman Year One, which is a more modern. Frank Miller did Year One, didn't he? I think.
Yes, year one actually, yeah, came out before, obviously before year three. So
Yeah, I've heard of that one, but no, I never heard of Year Three. I didn't even know they continued beyond the Year One series. I wasn't aware of that. And Marv Wolfman, you said, wrote this no less, and he's a legendary writer. I mean, I've met Marv Wolfman a couple times. I invited him to the Phoenix Comic Con, and he took my invitation and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of cool. He was one of our first big guests for the Phoenix Comic Con. But yeah, that's pretty neat. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I was not aware they continued the series with all these different years.
yeah, he this particular series of books is really really good. And I've always loved it. So we were looking for something to pick. It's interesting because I talked before about when we did one of our earlier ones, and we talked about picking books off the spinner rack and getting a hold of Batman books was really difficult. I have this comic because of all the difficulties I was having of getting comics off of the spinner rack. I actually saved up my money and I actually bought a subscription directly from DC Comics for Batman. So this book actually came to me through the mail with a regular, comic subscription. I don't know if people still get just regular comic subscriptions like that anymore. It might be returning with what's going on, but yeah, no, I was pleasantly surprised when I got my subscription, and it started just a couple issues actually before this one. And was just really, really pleasantly surprised. This all of the year whatever stories for Batman were really good. Year one is like a classic. I mean, it's an absolute classic. Of course, they've adapted into an animated film as well, and the animated film is actually quite good. But year one is definitely a classic. Year two is a favorite among Batman fans. And for those people who love Todd McFarlane, because it was just fun to see Todd actually draw Batman. A lot of the things that he did later on with Spawn with the cape and stuff, he was doing with Batman, at that point.
I didn't even know Todd McFarlane ever did Batman. I thought he was
Yep.
a Marvel guy. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, actually, he got his. If I remember correctly, he was doing a series called Coyote, and he went from Coyote actually to Infinity Incorporated, and actually was on Infinity Incorporated for DC for at least a couple of years. And then he went from Infinity Incorporated, and then he did a couple of projects. He started and was on year two at one point, and he actually did the first issue and a half of actually the Invasion series as well. So yeah.
Hey PJ, glad to see that you were able to stop by. PJ from
Cool.
Orville Nation, stopping by saying hi. Little fan of Dave apparently, saying go Dave.
Thanks, PJ. We actually Peggy Oakes was actually on the show. She came over here and did the hashtag Orville Notion, and she got the sketch cards that we did actually on your show. So I thought that was really fun. So
yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool that she came over too.
Very cool. So that's going to be it for me. I can't recommend year three enough. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. It's a four-part series. If you get the individual issues, I don't think any of these are considered key issues. So I don't think they're going to set you back a lot. I will look it up here real quick while I continue to talk. But I don't think they're going to set you back quite a bit. But it's just a really great story. Like I said, they have collected this into trade. And it's definitely worth picking up. But then, like I said, too, all of the year whatever stories that they've done are quite good. Yeah, and I see what you're saying there, Bobby. Yeah, it does range between $4 to $6, $6 to $10. I see some here actually for 4 if you get more reader copies. Yeah.
So he's asking, Bobby's asking, is this the first appearance of Tim Drake?
I don't think it is.
He's saying if it is, he's got to check that out.
I don't think it is, because actually Tim Drake actually shows up in a Lonely Place of Dying, which is actually a storyline that actually comes later. So I don't think this is the first appearance of Tim Drake. They do reference events from year 3 and actually redraw panels, if I remember correctly, that Pat Broderick did in year 3. But I don't think year 3 introduces Tim Drake. I think that actually comes later. I don't think it does. Now I'm concerned. Now I'm wondering if maybe I thought it was A Lonely Place of Dying. Let me look it up just to be sure. Tim Drake first appearance. I'm going to the almighty Google. The almighty Google knows all. The almighty Google sees all, it seems like. Oh. Maybe it is. Yeah, I guess it is. How in the hell did I miss that? Yeah, there's no way. He's in this? I remember that as being a different story. Because it starts off with him actually following, unless they're saying that this sequence in here where the little kid meets Dick Grayson, surely that's not. I can't. Well, you may have got me there, Bobby. I didn't think this was Tim Drake's first appearance, but maybe it is. Son of a gun! It sure is. It's not a very important moment, but yeah, there's Tim right there as a little kid, because they actually redraw this scene. I think in A Lonely Place of Dying. So yeah, I think you're correct. This is technically Tim Drake's first appearance, probably. Wow, how did I miss that? Well, I consider myself more a Batman aficionado than a Robin aficionado, but it is kind of bad to blow some Robin trivia on his 80th anniversary. I feel like a real whatever right now. But good call, Bobby. You got me. Good call.
He says, "It's just what I read on the synopsis." He says, "I haven't read it yet."
I a lot, and I'll be honest with you. I remember the scene that's in this book being redrawn in another series to establish Tim Drake, but I don't think I ever specifically made the connection that is Tim Drake. Does that make sense? It's so weird. I remember them redrawing that moment from this story, but I just don't remember that moment being pivotal in this particular, you know what I mean? So, but you're correct that is the introduction of Tim Drake, and Tim Drake is one of the best Robins ever. I would put Tim Drake up there with Dick Grayson. Dick Grayson, in my opinion, is still the best Robin, but Tim Drake is. I loved everything they did with Tim Drake. So,
Bobby mentions it's like saying Wolverine's first appearance is the issue prior to his official first Hulk issue due to one panel, which I know that that's happened with other characters as well, where technically they were introduced like in one panel in a previous book and not fleshed out at all or anything like that. So
it's
that happens.
The Hulk 180 versus Hulk 181. I'm well aware of that. Hulk 181 is one of my Grail books. I owned Hulk 181 back in the day, and I've been trying to get a copy of it back, but it's gotten so expensive anymore. It's kind of difficult to afford that. But no, yeah, very good call, Bobby. Totally got me.